The morning had been built like a monument, stone by stone, ribbon by ribbon, carriage by carriage. Every family that mattered arrived as if attendance alone was a vote for the future, the sort of future that was supposed to be clean, inevitable, and profitable. The church looked the way England liked to look when it congratulated itself. Cold. Light through tall windows, polished brass, flowers chosen for restraint rather than joy, and a hush that did not come from reverence so much as from calculation. The aisle had become a corridor of judgments. Women in pale silks lifted their eyes and lowered them again with the same precision they used to lift teacups. Men checked their cuffs and pretended not to measure the room while measuring it anyway. It was not faith that packed the pews. It was consequence. A duke's marriage did not belong to the couple. It belonged to the county, to the ledgers, to the families who lived on proximity to his name. And at the center of all that certainty stood the bride, composed the way an heirloom. Portrait is composed, and the duke beside her, perfect in the severe way that made people mistake discipline for coldness. I had been placed where I always belonged, near enough to be useful, far enough to be overlooked. Not in the family pew, not in the servants' corner, but in the narrow space reserved for the respectable unimportant, the poor. Relation, the tolerated companion, the girl who existed to fill a chair when symmetry demanded it. I had been present at dinners where the silver outnumbered the smiles, at teas where every compliment carried a hidden measurement, at balls where I learned to move like a shadow so no one would have to admit I was there. I knew the rules better than most of the women who benefited from them. I knew how a glance could lift someone, how a pause could ruin them, how quickly a rumor could make a door heavy. I also knew that today was not meant to include me in any meaningful way. It was meant to close a chapter of uncertainty for the Duke's house and open a new one that everyone could invest in. The bride's family had been acting as if the marriage had already happened. The Duke's family had been acting as if the marriage was a duty fulfilled, not a desire chosen. And the room had agreed to behave as if love did not matter, as long as the world kept its shape. The ceremony moved forward with a smoothness that felt rehearsed by generations. There were prayers and responses that sounded less like emotion and more like tradition being recited to keep the earth steady. Hands came together at the expected moments, heads bowed with practiced modesty. The vicar's voice sat in the air like a thread meant to stitch the crowd into one witness. And then it reached the point everyone had come to. Here. The point where a man with a title that could move markets was supposed to bind himself to a woman whose family could quiet debts. A duke's assent was meant to land like a stamp, final, legal, and irreversible. It did not. The refusal was not theatrical. There was no storming away, no raised voice, no sudden violence of feeling that could be dismissed as temper. It was a stillness first, a pause long enough for the room to realize something had changed, and then the word itself delivered with the same control the Duke used to deliver everything. Firm enough to be undeniable, calm enough to be terrifying. The church did not erupt. It froze. Breath stopped in pockets. Fabric stopped. Whispering. A fan halted mid-air as if its owner had forgotten the function of her own hands. The bride's posture held for a heartbeat longer than nature should allow, as if she could keep the future in place by refusing to wobble. Somewhere behind me, a man shifted his weight and immediately corrected it, as if movement itself had become improper. What followed was worse than noise. It was the speed at which minds began to work. In a room like that, panic wore gloves. Scandal did not shout. It calculated. I felt it move through the pews like an invisible tide. Who had guaranteed what? Who would be blamed? Which alliances would survive the hour? The bride's mother's face remained arranged, but her eyes went sharp and flat, the look of someone already counting losses. A cousin of the Duke's, known for smiling too easily, didn't smile at all. The Duke's eldest aunt, who had once reduced a young baronet to social ash with a single comment about his table manners, sat straighter, as if this were a contest she had been waiting to win. And the Duke's mother, whose authority in the household had always felt like a second title, did not move her hands, but tightened them together until the gloves creased. The vicar faltered. The ritual, built to handle happiness and perhaps grief, had no elegant place for refusal at this altitude. The room waited for someone to fix it, to patch the tear. In the fabric of respectability. The bride was still standing, as if she might be transformed into a statue rather than be seen as a woman who had just been refused. Her veil caught the window light and looked almost unreal, like a trick of mist. She kept her chin lifted. She did not collapse into humiliation. She did not plead. That was why she had been chosen. She understood performance. She understood that even shame must be carried with dignity if it is to be survived. The Duke turned his head, not toward the vicar, not toward the bride, not toward his mother. He turned toward the congregation, and it was the first time I saw him look at the crowd as if it were what it truly was, an audience that believed it owned him. His gaze moved with deliberate care, passing over faces that had feasted on his presence for years, passing over men who depended on his favor, women who had built their daughters' futures around his name. And then, without haste, without searching, he found me. That alone was enough to split the room again. Because a duke did not look at someone like me in public. He did not locate me among the silks and titles as if my presence had weight. I had been ignored by people with less power than him. I had been treated as furniture by women who could not afford a scandal. And yet his attention landed on me with the same certainty as his refusal had landed on the altar. He said my name, not loudly, not as a proclamation, simply as fact, as if it belonged in that sacred space as much as any family crest. It was the cruelest kind of clarity, because the moment he named me, he gave the room something to seize, something to interpret, something to destroy. A name is a hook in society. A name allows judgment to attach itself and pull. I felt my body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with winter. Heat rose in my face, not from romance, not from thrill, but from the raw terror of visibility. I had spent years surviving by being unremarkable. I had learned to make my presence small enough to avoid comment. I had practiced softness so no one would accuse me of ambition. But now the most powerful man in the county had pointed at me without pointing, had placed me inside the story everyone would tell by nightfall. Everything after that became a chain reaction of silent decisions. The bride's sister blinked once too quickly and looked away as if shame could be contagious. A gentleman who had greeted me politely at a previous house party now stared at the floor with studied neutrality, already distancing himself from whatever I had become. Two matrons exchanged a glance that moved like a knife. The look that said they had always suspected something, even if they had never once imagined it. The Duke's mother finally moved her head, a slow turn that brought her gaze onto me like a weight. Her expression did not change, but the air around her did. It was the look of someone who did not tolerate unpredictability, especially not the kind that humiliated a family in public. And the bride, so controlled, so rehearsed, shifted her eyes toward me for the first time. Not with fury, not with tears, with assessment. As if I were not a girl at all, but a problem placed on her path by fate and now requiring elimination. Her composure held, and that composure was its own threat. A woman who breaks can be pitied. A woman who stays perfectly intact can be feared. I did not move, I could not. Not because I was overcome by sentiment, but because movement would have been interpreted as guilt. If I stood, they would say I had planned it. If I fled, they would say I had been caught. If I looked down, they would say I could not meet the consequences of my own scheming. So I did the only thing that had ever allowed me to remain inside rooms I was not meant to enter. I stayed still and let my face become calm enough to be unreadable. The church did what it always does when society suffers a fracture. It tried to pretend the fracture was not there. People waited for protocol to rescue them. The vicar gathered himself with trembling dignity. The Duke remained upright, unflinching, as if the refusal had cost him nothing. Yet I saw the truth in the smallest details. His jaw held tight, not from anger, but from the strain of decision. His hand, near his side, curled once and relaxed again with discipline. He was not a man indulging impulse. He was a man choosing ruin with open eyes. Outside the church, the world that had been arranged for celebration began to reassemble itself into something sharper. Servants who had been instructed to smile now stood with careful blank faces, waiting for orders they could not predict. Carriages pulled up not to deliver guests, but to retrieve them from danger, as if remaining too long might stain a family. Mothers gathered daughters like valuable silk. Men formed small clusters where they could speak in low voices without appearing to gossip. The bride's party moved as one body, stiff and swift, a retreat that tried to look like dignity. The Duke's relatives did not follow. They paused, as if deciding whether to acknowledge him or punish him. The Duke's mother did not rush to him. She allowed distance, the kind of distance that makes a message clear without a scene. I became aware, in the middle of all that motion, that I had no place to go. I belonged to no carriage. I had no family who would claim me loudly enough to protect me from speculation. I had no companion whose presence would grant me innocence. The household that employed my quiet usefulness would, by nightfall, question whether it could afford to keep me. My social position had always been fragile. Now it was flammable. The Duke did not approach me in full view of the crowd. That would have been a second explosion, and he understood explosions. Instead, he moved with intention through the chaos, speaking briefly to his solicitor with a gesture that suggested urgency rather than scandal. The solicitor's face stayed professional, but his eyes flicked toward me in a way that made my stomach tighten. Documents were already forming a second ceremony, legal, sharp, unavoidable. I watched the Duke's mother draw the solicitor aside, her lips moving in words I could not hear. There was no softness in her posture. She was not negotiating feelings. She was negotiating survival. When the crowd began to thin, I was guided, not gently, not cruelly, simply efficiently, into a side passage of the church by a woman who had always treated me with polite indifference. Her touch on my sleeve felt like the first time she had ever acknowledged that I had skin. She did not look at my face. She did not offer comfort. She was obeying instructions that would soon determine whether she kept her position. The passage smelled of stone and old wax. It was quieter there, but not safe. The silence held its own kind of danger because it allowed thought. In that narrow space, the enormity of what had happened settled onto me in layers. The Duke's refusal had not elevated me into a romance. It had dragged me into a battlefield. The bride's family would not allow this story to stand without correction. The Duke's family would not forgive public humiliation without extracting payment. Society would not tolerate a disruption in hierarchy without forcing someone to bleed for it. And the simplest, most practical target was me, the girl who could not defend herself with a title. I tried to trace the path that had led here, not because I believed in fate, but because in England, nothing of this scale is ever sudden. There had been moments, small, easy to dismiss, when the Duke's attention had lingered too long on a room I occupied. A pause at a doorway, a redirected invitation, a servant sent with a cloak when rain surprised the party, a seat adjusted so I would not be caught in the direct line of mockery. I had treated those moments the way poor women must treat kindness, cautiously, without belief, careful not to turn it into a claim. Kindness can be withdrawn. Claims provoke punishment. Now, in the church's shadowed passage, those moments rearranged themselves into a pattern that frightened me more than any rumor. Because patterns imply intent. Intent implies planning. And planning implies that someone, perhaps the Duke himself, had been moving pieces long before today, preparing for a day when the world would be forced to look at what it had ignored. A footman arrived, breath controlled, expression guarded, carrying a sealed note as if it were heavier than paper had any right to be. He did not hand it to me. He hesitated first, as if unsure whether addressing me directly had become improper or unavoidable. Then he offered it. With both hands, his eyes still fixed on a point just beside my shoulder, the trained courtesy of someone who did not want to be seen choosing sides. The seal was not the Duke's crest. It was older, pressed into wax with a mark I had seen only once before, on a locked box in the back of the estate library, a box I had been told never to dust, never to move, never to mention. The wax was dark, nearly black, and the paper itself looked too fine for ordinary correspondence, the kind reserved for matters that should not exist. My name was written across it in a hand that did not belong to any living person I knew. And behind me, in the quiet of the passage, the Duke's mother's steps stopped just close enough for me to feel her presence without turning around. The seal sat on the paper like a bruise that had taken years to bloom. I did not break it in the corridor. In houses like ours, paper could be more dangerous than pistols, because it ruined people without smoke or blood. The footman waited with his eyes turned aside, disciplined, enough to pretend he was not witnessing the shift of a girl from harmless background to contested object. Behind me, the Duke's mother held her stillness like a lesson. Comfort was not on offer, only control. I turned the envelope once, letting the wax catch the thin light. The mark was not the Duke's crest, and that alone explained the tension in the servants who hovered at a careful distance. A household can survive a scandal if the scandal is new. Old marks mean old stories, and old stories never die quietly. The handwriting on my name looked formal, slanted, and unwavering, the sort of hand that belonged to someone who never had to hurry. It assumed obedience. I slid the note into my reticule without opening it. That decision was not bravery. It was instinct. If I read it there, my face would betray me before my manners could. And in a season when the smallest tremor could be translated into guilt, I could not afford to give them a reaction they could sell. The Duke's mother guided me out through a side door, not by taking my arm, but by moving first, forcing the space to behave as if her path was the only reasonable one. Outside, carriages were already turning, wheels cutting the gravel as if leaving quickly could erase what had happened. The churchyard looked stripped of celebration, as if flowers had been arranged for someone else. A few guests lingered only long, enough to be seen leaving at the correct moment, because even departure is a statement when the room lives on statements. No one looked back twice. Looking back meant involvement, too. I was placed into a carriage I had never been invited to enter before, lined in dark fabric smelling faintly of polished wood and winter apples. Curtains were drawn, not to protect me from weather, but to protect the family from witnesses who might later claim they saw me traveling like a lady. Status did not have to be spoken. It was enforced by what was allowed to be visible. The footman shut the door with careful finality, as if sound itself could be interpreted. The Duke did not ride with us. That absence was a deliberate strategy. If he had been seen beside me, the story would have hardened into a shape too simple to dismantle. By keeping distance, he prevented the county from witnessing an intimacy it would never forgive, while still arranging my removal from the church as if I were already under his roof. Power, at times, is the ability to choose. Which scandal is permitted to be clear? The estate gates received us with the same indifference they offered to all storms. The house rose behind bare trees with its familiar calm, windows catching dull daylight, stone refusing to change its face. I had walked those steps many times with my eyes lowered, carrying baskets, letters, folded linens, always careful not to appear as if I belonged. Today the same steps felt narrower, watched, and dangerous. Even the gravel seemed to report on me. Inside, the house behaved as if it had been struck by lightning but could not admit it. Hallways that usually flowed with quiet purpose became too clean, too corrected. Maids paused and then continued as if their bodies had learned to pretend. A butler I had known for years acknowledged me with a fraction less indifference than usual, which was more alarming than any insult. Indifference can be a shield. Attention is exposure. I was taken not to the servant quarters and not to the drawing room, but to a small sitting room near the library used for consultations meant to remain private. That choice spoke louder than any reprimand. It meant the household did not know what I was yet. It meant they feared me enough to keep me contained. The Duke's mother sat across from me at a distance that preserved hierarchy while pretending to offer civility. A fire was lit, not for my comfort, but to ensure the room stayed occupied and guarded. Her eyes went first to my reticule. They did not ask permission. They simply took inventory. Then she looked at my face, as if comparing the girl she had tolerated for years with the girl the world had been forced to notice. Her expression stayed composed, but the air sharpened around it. She was measuring what could be salvaged and what would have to be sacrificed. In that house, sacrifice was never dramatic. It was always tidy. In that room, my history became relevant in a way it never had before. I had been received into this household as one receives an unwanted book, shelved, used when convenient, ignored when it might offend. In ballrooms, I was seated where a hostess could claim generosity without risking her table's symmetry. At dinners, I was offered conversation only when someone wished to display kindness. I learned early that invisibility was protection, and that protection required surrendering every right to be seen. The county had never needed my name. That was why the Duke's voice in the church had felt like a blade. A name is a hook. Once it exists in public, judgment has something to cling to, and judgment arrived faster than any carriage could travel. By late afternoon, messages had already moved between houses. Luncheon plans postponed, visits delayed, charitable committees suddenly reconsidering their schedules. A lady who had vowed to call withdrew her card with such speed that it felt like self-preservation. A note arrived from the bride's mother, delivered by a servant too polished to show haste. It was brief, correct, and sharp in its restraint. It requested clarification of circumstances, expressed concern for reputations placed at risk, and implied that restitution, in whatever form, would be expected. The Duke's mother read it once, set it face down, and did not allow anyone else to see it. That act alone told me she was not merely angry. She was preparing a campaign. Only after dusk did the Duke return, entering by the side way that avoided witnesses. He looked the same as he had at the altar, controlled, unbroken. But the line beneath his cheekbones seemed harder, as if he had been grinding decisions into his own bones. He placed himself near the window where light could fall across him without making him appear softened. When he looked at me, there was no romance offered as escape. There was recognition, and something colder. Resolve. His mother did not rise for him. She did not soften. Her stillness communicated what she could not afford to say plainly. That love, if it existed, was irrelevant beside inheritance, alliances, and the survival of the house's name. He accepted her posture without flinching. That was the truest sign of how grave things were. When tenderness disappears from performance, the matter has moved beyond family and into governance. I withdrew the sealed envelope and placed it on the table between us. The Duke's gaze dropped to the wax, and the smallest change crossed his face. Recognition without surprise, as if he had expected this mark to surface sooner or later. His mother's eyes narrowed, by a fraction, the way a blade narrows when it meets resistance. The envelope remained unopened, yet it already rearranged the room. Servants slipped away as if an invisible bell had rung. A house can sense when a secret has entered, and it tightened its silence around it. My fingers did not tremble as I touched the seal. They went numb, which was worse. Numbness is the body's confession that it expects pain. I waited for a nod that never came. Neither the Duke nor his mother offered permission, because permission would place responsibility on them. If I broke the seal, the act would be mine. And in a world that punishes women for outcomes, being the actor can become the crime. So I broke it. Anyway, carefully, cleanly, in a way that did not tear the paper more than necessary. The wax cracked with a sound too small to match the danger it carried. I unfolded the letter and let my eyes move across lines that smelled faintly of age, as if the paper had been kept near cedar to preserve it. The hand was firm, the wording was formal. It spoke of a guardianship set down for the avoidance of future dispute, of a child to be protected from the hazards of public knowledge, and of an inheritance to be held in trust until certain conditions were met. It named the estate, the library, the locked box I had been forbidden to touch. It named my mother in a way I had never heard spoken in the household, attaching her not to shame, but to obligation. And it placed my own name inside a sentence that did not ask my consent, only my patience. My mind tried to reject what my eyes had already confirmed. In this house, I had always been treated as if my existence required their permission. The letter suggested the opposite, that my existence had been accounted for long before my father died, and that my presence here had never been merely convenient. It had been arranged. I lifted my eyes from the page to the Duke's face, and for the first time since the altar, I saw uncertainty touch him. Not fear, not regret, but the tension of a man discovering that the thing he believed he controlled had roots older than his own choices. The Duke's mother did not reach for the letter. She watched me watch him, as if measuring which of us understood the consequences first. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the soft sequence of distant sounds, Shutters being closed, steps repositioned, doors checked twice, like a fortress, preparing for siege while pretending nothing had happened. And in the pause between those disciplined noises, I noticed the smallest, most unsettling detail of all. The Duke's signet ring was no longer on his hand. The absence of the Duke's signet ring did not announce itself the way a confession would. It sat in the room like a missing stitch in a garment everyone pretended was flawless. In a house governed by symbols, a ring was not decoration. It was authority made portable. Without it, even the air changed. Servants who would normally accept an order with a glance now waited for written instruction. The butler's posture turned fractionally more formal, as if the walls had begun to listen for legal certainty. The Duke's mother did not ask for the ring, because asking would admit vulnerability. She simply recalculated every movement in the household as if the loss had been anticipated. By the morning, the county had begun its work. News did not travel as a shout, it traveled as a refinement. The first version had been crude, something like a duke losing his senses at the altar. By breakfast, it had become a more respectable tale, a nobleman interrupted by conscience, perhaps by a new discovery regarding contracts, perhaps by the bride's family pressing too hard. By luncheon, it had turned into a moral story, one that allowed listeners to feel both shocked and virtuous. And somewhere inside each retelling, my name remained, altering shape like smoke. Some said it with disgust, some with curiosity, some as if it were a caution. Cards stopped arriving, not all at once, not dramatically. That would have been too honest. They simply failed to appear, or arrived addressed to the Duke's mother without, including me, as if omission could restore order. A tea planned for Tuesday was postponed to an unspecified date. A charitable meeting required reconsideration. A neighbor's wife, who had once nodded at me with a rehearsed kindness, sent a note of sudden ill health. Society in that era did not always attack. It often starved. It withdrew recognition. It withheld association. It made you feel your social hunger like a sickness. The Duke did not leave the estate. He allowed the county to imagine him secluded by shame, while he moved through the house with a purpose that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with geometry. He spoke with the solicitor behind closed doors. He ordered inventories, not of silver but of paper, old deeds, sealed correspondence, account ledgers, anything that might contain the kind of truth that ruins a marriage contract or validates a bloodline. The library, which had once been a place of quiet, became a battlefield of documents. Lamps stayed lit longer than they should. The scent of dust and leather deepened as drawers were opened that had not been touched in years. I was not hidden away, but I was also not permitted to move freely. That was the quiet cruelty of the arrangement, to keep me within reach, yet deny me the dignity of belonging. I ate in a smaller room at odd hours, not as punishment, but as precaution. The servants' manners toward me sharpened into a new form. Those who feared scandal became excessively polite, as if courtesy could protect them from association. Those who feared being seen as loyal avoided my eyes entirely. And a few, the older ones who understood that houses survive by protecting their own secrets, treated me with the gentlest kind of restraint, offering a shawl, adjusting a tray, small acts that said they were watching the floor for cracks. The Duke's mother began to receive visitors who arrived in plain carriages and left by the side road. They were not friends. Friends require celebration. These were advisors, relatives with distant titles, clergymen with connections, men whose names were never spoken loudly, but whose signatures mattered. They entered with careful faces and departed with careful faces, and the hallway outside her sitting room smelled increasingly of damp wool and caution. The household had shifted from mourning a scandal to managing a crisis. Then came the bride's counterweight. It arrived not as an outburst, but as a campaign dressed in virtue. The bride's family sent a second note, longer, more refined, filled with the language of concern and the structure of accusation. It did not attack the Duke directly. It suggested confusion, pressure, the strain of duty, things that could be forgiven if corrected quickly. It implied that the refusal might be reversed or at least clarified in a manner that restored the bride's dignity. And then, with elegant cruelty, it introduced the idea that certain persons, certain influences, should be removed from the Duke's household to prevent further disturbance. I understood at once that I had become their most convenient cure. They did not need proof that I had done anything. In society, the wrong person being noticed is proof enough. If they could make me disappear, the Duke's refusal could be reframed as temporary illness, a brief weakness corrected by proper guidance. If I remained, I would force the county to accept a new narrative, one that threatened the bride's family with loss and the Duke's family with unpredictable change. Families will forgive many things. They do not forgive threats to their future. The Duke's mother held the second note between her fingers as if it were stained. She did not tear it. Tearing is emotional. She placed it into a folder the solicitor carried, filed like an early weapon. She then did something more dangerous than anger. She became courteous. Her courtesy reached the staff first. Servants were reminded of household rules with unusual calm. Doors that had once been left open were now closed. Keys shifted hands. A list appeared on the butler's desk outlining new protocols. Deliveries logged, callers announced, messages recorded. Nothing about me was written. Nothing had to be. The house spoke through systems, and systems had the coldest voice of all. When she turned her attention toward me, the effect was similar. She did not scold. She did not threaten. She simply altered my environment until it became clear that my safety depended on her judgment. A cloak was removed from my usual chair. My writing paper was replaced with a smaller stack. My access to the library was restricted for my own good. In a world that loved propriety, control could be framed as care, and care could be used to make a person obedient. The Duke responded without performing rebellion. He did not argue in hallways. He did not raise his voice. He simply began to separate authority from tradition, inch by inch, as if removing a splinter. He issued orders in writing, ensuring they were recorded. He transferred certain accounts to the solicitor's oversight, making it harder for relatives to interfere. He altered the schedule of the estate, bringing forward repairs, delaying entertainments, canceling visits that would have provided opportunities for confrontation. It was a quiet assertion that he still governed the house, ring or no ring. Yet even he could not prevent the county from forming its own tribunal. A rumor surfaced at a luncheon 2 estates away, delivered with the kind of pity that burns. It suggested that my mother had not died as a respectable woman should have, but as a woman with a story. It suggested that I had been placed in the Duke's household not out of kindness but to conceal something inconvenient. It hinted at improper familiarity, nothing explicit, nothing that could be challenged in court, only enough to stain. The rumor spread because it served multiple needs at once. It excused the bride's humiliation by giving her a villain. It excused the Duke's refusal by blaming temptation. It excused the county's fascination by disguising it as moral concern. I saw the rumor's effect in small changes that would have been invisible to anyone untrained in the language of contempt. A maid, who had once offered me a smile, now offered only a curt nod. A footman lingered longer in the doorway when delivering tea, as if ensuring he could later report what he saw. The cook asked fewer questions. The housekeeper's inventory of linens suddenly included my sheets twice, an unnecessary precision that made me aware my existence was being tracked. The Duke's mother invited the rector for a private breakfast. That single decision revealed the shape of her strategy. She intended to anchor her version of events in religion, not because she was pious, but because morality was a stronger weapon than gossip. If she could position herself as the guardian of virtue, she could justify any act of removal. Even mercy can be weaponized when it comes from above. The letter I had opened, my mother's name, the locked box, the trust, began to pulse beneath everything like a hidden drum. It was the only reason I had not been dismissed already. A household might discard a girl if she was merely inconvenient. It could not discard a girl if she represented a legal complication. Paper grants survival in aristocratic homes more reliably than affection. The Duke's solicitor requested to see me again, and this time I was not taken to a small sitting room but to the study. That shift was deliberate. Studies are where decisions become permanent. The Duke sat at his desk with a stack of documents arranged like a controlled storm. The solicitor stood beside him, quiet, watchful, his face trained into neutrality. On a side table, the locked box from the library had been brought out at last, its surface polished, its old seal intact. No one touched it immediately. That was another kind of suspense. Even the Duke, who had refused an altar full of witnesses, hesitated before a box with a history. Because a box like that could change inheritance lines. It could damage alliances. It could confirm a truth so inconvenient it would tear the house apart from the inside. When the seal was finally broken, it was done with the same care used for a will. The lid lifted without drama, revealing paper wrapped in cloth, tied with ribbon that had faded into the color of dried blood. Inside were documents older than my memory, correspondence with legal stamps, a birth record written in a hand that matched the letter, and a small, thin piece of jewelry, an old ring, not a signet, but something intimate, worn smooth by long use. The Duke did not pick up the ring. He looked at it as if it were evidence. The solicitor unfolded the birth record and aligned it beside another document, comparing dates with a practiced eye. The names on the page were clean and formal, yet the implication was not. It did not announce a scandal with crude clarity. It suggested something more. Dangerous. Legitimacy written into a corner where no one had looked, a line of connection that had been hidden not because it was sinful, but because it was inconvenient. My mother's name appeared again, attached to a title I had never heard associated with her. Not a title she held, but a relation she had. The Duke's family name appeared near it, not as an accusation, but as an obligation, words that implied duty, guardianship, and the careful protection of a child from public dispute. The language was the language of men who feared lawsuits more than they feared shame. I remained seated, breathing as quietly as possible, feeling the room tighten around the idea that I might not be merely a tolerated dependent. That possibility shifted everything. If I had a claim, any claim, then removing me would not be simple. If I had a claim, then the bride's family's insistence on banishment would look less like moral correction and more like theft. And if I had a claim, the Duke's refusal at the altar would no longer be a romantic impulse or a scandalous whim. It would become a strategic act, an interruption of a marriage that might have compromised the estate's future in ways the county did not yet understand. The Duke's mother entered the study without being announced. That alone showed how far the house had moved into emergency. She glanced once at the open box, and something hard settled into her expression. She had known this was possible. She had perhaps been guarding against it for years. Her gaze moved to me, not with disgust, not with pity, but with the appraisal reserved for an unpredictable asset. A girl can be dismissed. A claimant must be managed. By evening, a carriage arrived from the bride's family, discreet, but unmistakably expensive, its crest visible enough to be read by any servant who could read. It did not come with flowers or apology. It came with a sealed packet delivered to the Duke's mother, who accepted it without changing her face. The butler carried it inside as if it were fragile, yet his hands were steady, suggesting he already understood it. Was not paper that would break first. The packet was placed on the study table beside the open box. Two families' secrets sat within inches of each other, and the air between them felt thinner than thread. The Duke did not open the packet immediately. He watched it as if waiting for it to reveal its intention through silence alone, while his mother's composure sharpened into something close to satisfaction, because whatever was inside, it had arrived on her terms. And in that moment, with the locked box open and my mother's name staring up from old ink, the smallest movement in the room carried the weight of a verdict. The Duke reached for his missing signet ring, not to put it on, but to set it on the desk beside the bride's sealed packet, as if preparing to sign something that would make the county's whispers irrelevant. The signet ring on the desk did not look like a piece of jewelry anymore. It looked like a lever. In that room, the smallest objects had become instruments, wax seals that could move entire households, ribbons that could bind a future, and paper that could turn a living person into a legal obstacle. The Duke's hand hovered near the ring without claiming it, as if even touching it would declare a side too early. The bride's family packet sat opposite, sealed and immaculate, the kind of immaculate that suggested it had been prepared long before the church had filled with witnesses. The Duke's mother remained standing, not because she lacked a chair, but because she understood posture as a weapon. The solicitor waited with ink ready, his face trained into the neutral patience of men who do not fall when families do. The packet's contents were revealed in pieces, not because anyone wished to dramatize them, but because each page required its own calculation. It was not a direct accusation because direct accusations invite defense. It was a sequence of respectable concerns. The bride's honor damaged publicly, the family standing endangered by an unexplained refusal, the need for immediate clarification to restore order, and, folded into the language like a hidden blade, the recommendation that I be removed from the household to prevent further contamination of the Duke's judgment. The tone was outwardly charitable. The implication was ruthless. They were offering a solution that allowed everyone to pretend the real problem was an influence, not a decision. That recommendation did not belong to the bride alone. It was a chorus written by a family with resources and the knowledge that society prefers simple villains. A duke refusing at the altar is complex. A young woman tempting him is simple. The county would choose simplicity because it allowed them to feel shocked without feeling threatened. The first effect was not my dismissal. It was something worse. My isolation becoming official. A new routine formed around me without a single announcement. Breakfast became a tray delivered at an hour when the household had already finished. My letters, few as they were, passed through the housekeeper's hands as if paper might carry contagion. The library door that had once been merely discouraged became locked, and the key moved to a ring that hung at the butler's waist. When I walked through the corridor, small conversations stopped, not with cruelty, but with survival. Everyone understood that the Duke's refusal had created two categories in the house: those who would be protected when the consequences arrived, and those who would be blamed to protect everyone else. Meanwhile, outside the estate walls, the county adjusted its manners in the most devastating way possible. It began to treat the scandal as settled. That week, invitations were reissued with new guest lists. Names shifted on seating charts as if correcting an error. A dinner at a neighboring estate that would usually have included our household suddenly became intimate family only. A charity committee that relied on the Duke's patronage moved forward without his signature, signaling they believed his authority was compromised. At the milliner's shop in town, the seamstresses lowered their voices when our crest was mentioned, as if the very emblem might stain the fabric. Even the weather seemed to participate in the judgment. Gray skies, bare branches, the world stripped of softness in a season that offered no forgiveness. The bride did not appear in public as a wrecked woman. That would have invited sympathy, but also questions. Instead, she performed resilience, and resilience in a wronged bride reads like virtue. She attended church the following Sunday, modestly dressed, face composed, eyes lowered at the correct moments. Her mother sat close, a figure of dignified injury. The family did not glare at the world. They allowed the world to stare at them, and the world rewarded them with compassion that could later be converted into pressure. The Duke's mother received visits that were technically casual, but practically political. Distant relatives arrived to offer support, which meant to assess whether the Duke's judgment could still be trusted. A baronet's wife came bearing preserves, which meant her husband came bearing questions. A clergyman returned twice in 1 week, which meant someone had asked him to. Every visitor left with a slightly different story because the Duke's mother did not try to stop gossip. She tried to shape it. She spoke with careful language, suggesting emotional strain, duty, the burden of leadership, and the necessity of restoring stability. And always, woven through her restraint, was the suggestion that stability required removing the irregular element. I began to understand that my existence in the house had never been merely inconvenient. It had been convenient until it became expensive. The household's quiet discipline tightened further after an incident that was designed to look like accident. Small object went missing from a display cabinet in a corridor that servants passed daily. It was not valuable enough to attract thieves and not trivial enough to ignore. The timing was too perfect. The discovery happened shortly after a visitor left, and the first person asked about the corridor was me. asked without accusation, with polite inquiry, as if suspicion could be served with tea. No one said I had taken it. No one needed to. The question itself did the damage. It planted the idea in every mind that already wanted a reason to remove me. It gave servants an excuse to watch me without feeling disloyal. It gave the county a detail that sounded plausibly shameful and therefore irresistible. The Duke's response to the missing object was not an emotional defense of me. It was a methodical dismantling of the trap. He ordered a ledger of entries and exits, not because he believed in perfect records, but because the act of ordering them reminded the house who still commanded it. He had the corridor searched in a way that did not humiliate anyone publicly, which ensured the guilty party remained uncertain and therefore afraid. He requested the presence of the housekeeper and the footman responsible for the cabinet, not to scold, but to observe whose composure shifted too quickly. It was governance performed as calm. The object was found where it had been placed to be. Found behind a heavy drape in a room I had not entered all week. The location was almost insulting in its simplicity. The trap had never depended on proof. It depended on the willingness of people to believe. The discovery ended nothing. It simply forced the conspirators to adjust their approach. When the easy route fails, society moves to harder, more permanent forms of damage. The next attack was not about theft, it was about birth. A rumor circulated that my mother's relationship to the estate had been improper, that I had been raised in the house as a tolerated secret, that the letter in the locked box existed not to protect me, but to protect the family from shame. It was the kind of rumor that cannot be disproved with a single document because it does not claim a specific fact. It claims an atmosphere. It makes people feel they have always sensed something. And once people feel they have sensed something, they stop needing evidence. I watched the rumor take effect in the smallest social fractures. The steward became colder, because stewards fear disorder more than they fear injustice. The kitchen maids grew wary of being friendly, because friendliness becomes a liability when a house is under scrutiny. Even the gardener's wife, who had once slipped me a small bunch of winter herbs with a look of quiet kindness, stopped leaving anything by the back steps. Not because she had turned cruel, but because she had turned careful. Inside the family, the tension became a fault line. The Duke's younger brother, always eager to please the elders, began to spend more time with their mother, his posture aligning with hers, as if learning the shape of her authority. A cousin with financial dependencies visited and left. Quickly, face tight, refusing to meet my eyes. A married aunt who once treated me as harmless ornament now avoided the estate entirely, citing travel. None of it was declared. It did not need to be. The family was quietly dividing into those who believed the Duke had lost control and those who feared he was about to take it in a way that would reduce their influence. The Duke did not offer me comfort in the way novels like to imagine. He offered protection in the only way that mattered in our world. He refused to let me be handled by other hands. A solicitor's clerk arrived with papers regarding temporary arrangements, the kind that sound innocent and become permanent. The Duke declined to sign them. He did not call attention to his refusal. He simply redirected the clerk to his own solicitor, forcing the matter into a channel he controlled. He moved certain household accounts out of his mother's direct reach, not removing her power, but ensuring she could no longer act without leaving traces. He requested official copies of parish records, not because he trusted them blindly, but because he understood that the county respects ink stamped by institutions more than it respects truth. And still, none of it stopped the social hunger for a conclusion. The bride's family escalated with a strategy that was both elegant and brutal. They stopped asking for clarification and began preparing a statement. It did not arrive as an announcement in the newspaper, because that would have been vulgar. It arrived as a series of private communications to influential households, letters written with restrained sorrow, explaining that the family wished to avoid scandal, but had been forced into protective measures. Protective. Measures in aristocratic language can mean anything. A legal claim for damages, a petition to secure the return of gifts, a moral appeal to isolate a household, a request for clergy intervention, or the most dangerous of all, an attempt to involve the trustees who governed certain aspects of the estate's inheritance. That last possibility turned the Air in the study cold when the Duke's solicitor mentioned it. Trustees do not care about love, they care about continuity. If the bride's family could persuade trustees that the Duke's judgment was compromised, they could pressure him into compliance without ever needing to win the public argument. It was a quieter form of coercion, and therefore, more effective. The locked box documents became the center of the Duke's strategy, not because they offered romance, but because they offered leverage. The papers did not paint me as a seductress, they painted me as a responsibility. And in that era, responsibility carries a weight society cannot ignore. If I had been placed under guardianship, if I had been protected by legal language, if there were clauses tied to inheritance and legitimacy, then removing me would not be a cleansing act. It would be interference. It would look like tampering with a trust, and that could destroy reputations more reliably than any gossip. The Duke's mother understood this before anyone else. Her restraint began to falter, not into anger but into urgency. She arranged a dinner at the estate under the guise of restoring calm, inviting a small circle of relatives and 2 men whose presence made the household stand straighter, a magistrate's cousin and a trustee's representative. The guest list was a declaration. It said the family intended to resolve matters within acceptable structures, with the right witnesses, on their own ground. I was not told I would attend, yet my place at the table was set. That detail mattered more than any overt invitation. A place set means a person must be accounted for, either as family, as a ward, as a guest, or as a problem being displayed. The ambiguity was a warning. It meant the evening was not meant to comfort me. It was meant to test whether the house could survive my visibility. The dinner itself moved with the slow cruelty of politeness. Courses arrived flawlessly timed. The silver flashed under candlelight. The conversation remained correct. Land improvements, weather, charity, topics that allow people to pretend they are not circling a scandal like wolves. Yet beneath every sentence there was a second conversation, carried through looks and pauses, and the way a glass is set down more firmly than required. I understood my new position by the smallest changes. The servant who poured wine hesitated at my shoulder, as if unsure whether he was allowed to serve me first or last. The trustee's representative glanced at me not with curiosity but with calculation. The magistrate's cousin watched the Duke's hands more than his face, as if waiting for a sign of instability. Even the Duke's mother's posture was a message. She sat in perfect command, but her gaze kept returning to me like an accountant returning to a troublesome line in a ledger. At the end of the meal, a sealed letter was brought in on a salver, not rushed, not apologized for. The butler presented it to the Duke's mother, who did not open it immediately. She allowed it to sit on the table for a heartbeat, ensuring everyone saw the seal. It was the bride's family. Crest. The Duke did not reach for it. He did not look away from it either. He let the room register that the bride's family had chosen this moment, this audience, this setting. They were making their move with witnesses present, so no one could later soften what happened. When the letter was finally opened, the Duke's mother read it silently, her face remaining composed until the very last line. Then, almost imperceptibly, her eyes lifted to me, not with triumph, not with hatred, but with a cold decision that settled over the table like ash. Across from her, the trustee's representative adjusted his gloves once, a small motion that signaled readiness. And before anyone spoke a single, unnecessary word, the Duke's solicitor placed a fresh sheet of paper beside the signet ring, aligning it with the precision of a man preparing a document that would not be forgiven. The paper placed beside the signet ring was not a threat. It was an announcement that the household had entered a stage where politeness would be used as evidence. Every person at the table understood it at once. A dinner could be forgiven as family difficulty. A document drafted in front of a trustee's representative belonged to the realm that outlived feelings. It belonged to property, inheritance, and authority, things the county respected more than any virtue performed in church. The Duke's mother held the bride's letter as if it were a delicate thing, yet her stillness made it heavier than lead. She did not read it aloud. Reading aloud creates spectacle, and spectacle invites sympathy. Instead, she let the letter function as an object that had already done its work. Faces around the table adjusted in controlled ways. The magistrate's cousin leaned back by a fraction, as if distancing himself from consequences. The trustee's representative lowered his gaze toward the blank page, ready to become the kind of witness who never forgets. I felt, without anyone needing to tell me, that the letter's last lines had not been written to negotiate. They had been written to corner. By morning, the house operated under a new rhythm. Nothing was overtly harsh, and that was the point. The staff were instructed to behave as though the estate's dignity had never been threatened. Curtains were opened at the usual hour. Fires were laid with the same precision. The silver was polished as if the shine could reflect stability back into the county's eyes. Yet within that normality, the doors around me remained quietly controlled. My movements were not forbidden, they were guided. Guidance, in an aristocratic household, is the language of confinement without scandal. The Duke did not speak to me in front of servants. He did not offer reassurance that could later be repeated as proof of attachment. Instead, he performed protection through arrangements. A maid who had always been reliable was assigned to my corridor, not as a companion, but as a buffer against accidents. My meals returned to the dining schedule, not because I had been accepted, but because the household needed to signal that I was not being punished into silence. And the library key, still hanging from the butler's ring, was moved, briefly, into the solicitor's custody. That shift alone told me the house had stopped pretending this was a domestic matter. The county responded with its favorite method of pressure, invitations that were not invitations. A large gathering was announced at the town hall under the polished name of charity, the sort of event that allowed the powerful to be seen as benevolent while measuring one another's stability. It was a seasonal subscription assembly, attended by families who would later claim they were present for the cause, not for the spectacle. The bride's family was publicly attached to the committee. The rector's wife was listed as a patroness. Even a trustee's name appeared among supporters. The message was quiet and unmistakable. The county had selected its stage, and the Duke's household would be expected to appear, submit, or be judged as guilty by absence. The Duke's mother accepted the notice with a calm that felt like stone cooling after fire. She understood. Appearances too well to refuse the arena. A refusal would look like shame. Attendance would look like courage, unless it looked like surrender. She did not allow the household to see hesitation. Instead, she made preparations that were too efficient to be merely social. Instructions to the groom regarding carriage routes, to the steward regarding accounts, to the butler regarding which servants would accompany us, and to the solicitor regarding which papers would travel in a locked case. It was not just an evening out. It was deployment. When the day arrived, the weather offered no softness. The air was clear in that cold English way that makes everything sharper, including judgment. The carriage moved through lanes lined with bare branches and stone walls toward a town that already felt crowded with expectation. I sat with my hands folded, dressed in restraint rather than beauty. In another life, modesty might have protected me. In this life, modesty would be interpreted as a disguise. The Duke's mother had ensured I could not be accused of flaunting ambition, but she had also ensured I would not blend into the background. The fabric was plain, but well made. The cloak was dark, but cut correctly. The message was precise. I was present, accounted for, and not dressed as a servant. At the hall, the scent of candle wax and winter wool met us like a familiar verdict. People stood in groups that looked casual, but were arranged with social mathematics. Those with wealth near the front, those with influence near the committee tables, those with lesser rank drifting at the edges, eager to catch the direction of power and follow it. When the Duke entered, movement rippled without anyone admitting they were reacting. Conversations adjusted mid-sentence. Smiles appeared and vanished as if borrowed and returned. And when I stepped in behind him, the ripple changed into something else. Visibility is not a single moment. It is the slow realization, shared by 100 people at once, that a person who once did not matter has been brought into the center by
authority. The hall did not greet me. It assessed me. That assessment came through gestures so small they would have been invisible to anyone not trained by years of surviving them. A lady's fan closing too quickly, a gentleman's bow becoming fractionally shallower, a committee member's eyes lifting with uninvited curiosity and then dropping with
careful neutrality. Even pity, offered by a distant cousin, landed like an insult because pity implies inevitability. The bride was already present. She stood near the patroness's table, surrounded by women in pale colors and polished composure. She wore neither triumph nor grief. She wore virtue. There was no sign of collapse, no evidence of humiliation, and that was precisely why the county favored her. She had been refused at the altar and had not broken, so the county could admire her and still blame someone else for the disruption. Her mother remained close, her face arranged into dignified restraint. Men approached them with solemn courtesies that implied support without entanglement. It was a portrait of injured respectability, designed to force the crowd into choosing sides without admitting that any choice had been made. The Duke did not drift. He moved with intention toward the committee, offering the expected contributions with the expected restraint, as if proving he could still fulfill public duty while privately destroying expectations. His mother placed herself exactly where she could be seen by the most important women in the room, not engaging too much, not retreating too far. She performed steadiness. The solicitor stood at a careful distance, close enough to respond, far enough to remain invisible as a legal presence. And I remained where the Duke's household required me, near enough to be unmistakable, far enough not to appear bold. The first strike came without words. It came through the arrival of a small group led by the trustee's representative, who held a sealed envelope as if it were merely a list. The representative did not announce anything. He did not need to. His presence alone signaled that this evening had been chosen not for music or charity, but for adjudication disguised as society. He approached the Duke's mother first, offering a formal nod. Then he shifted toward the bride's family, offering the same nod. The equality of the gesture was itself a weapon. It implied there were two parties in dispute, and both were respectable enough to warrant legal attention. Respectability, in that moment, became a trap. Once you are treated as a proper party, you must respond properly, even while being attacked. A committee member requested a brief private consultation in a side room, the sort reserved for storage and quiet arrangements. The request was polite, made with the expression of someone claiming necessity rather than appetite for scandal. Several influential figures drifted toward the same area as if by coincidence. The Duke's mother could not refuse. Refusal would look like guilt. And so, without any announcement, the evening shifted into its true purpose. In the side room, the air felt colder, less perfumed, stripped of performance. The trustee's representative presented a document that had been prepared in advance, a formal request for clarification of the Duke's marital refusal and its implications for future governance and trusteeship. It was written in clean language that pretended not to accuse, while positioning the Duke as a man whose judgment might require oversight. The bride's family's interests appeared through references to settlements and gifts. The Duke's household appeared through references to obligations and stability. And then, in the portion that mattered most, the document referenced an influence within the Duke's household whose continued presence threatened public order and proper decision-making. I was not named in that room, yet everyone's eyes performed the naming. The bride's mother did not speak. She did not need to. Her stillness suggested she was reluctantly allowing legal processes to protect her daughter's dignity. Her daughter remained composed, gaze lowered at the correct moments. A figure of virtue forced into unpleasant necessity. Their strategy was perfect. It made them appear reluctant to pursue justice, which is exactly how justice is weaponized by the powerful. The Duke listened without visible reaction. His face stayed controlled, his posture unyielding. Yet I saw his hand near the edge of the table tighten once, and then relax with discipline. That was the only sign the document had landed where it was designed to land. Not in his pride, but in his authority. The county did not want him to marry the bride anymore. It wanted him to be governable. The Duke's mother responded in the way she always did, by refusing to reveal emotion and by insisting on process. She asked to see the seals, the signatures, the precise wording. She forced the trustee's representative to justify the document as standard procedure rather than moral judgment. That insistence did not defend me. It defended the house. And in doing so, It prevented the bride's family from turning the attack into immediate removal. Then the Duke's solicitor produced the locked case. He did not open it dramatically. He simply placed it on the table and unlatched it with the calm of a man presenting inevitable truth. Inside were copies of the documents from the library box, carefully prepared, properly endorsed, stamped where necessary. He did not push them forward as a romantic revelation. He presented them as the only language the room truly respected: legality. The trustees' representatives' attention shifted at once. For the first time that evening, the representatives' neutrality showed a crack. Not surprise, but alertness. Documents tied to trusts and guardianship are not gossip. They are structural. If the papers were genuine, they transformed me from an influence into a protected party. They turned the idea of removing me from a moral convenience into a legal risk. The Duke's solicitor laid out the records with methodical clarity. References to guardianship, to obligations assumed by the estate, to a deliberate concealment designed not to hide shame but to prevent public dispute. The documents did not claim I was a noble lady in the way the county would recognize with comfort. They claimed something more unsettling: that the house had been bound to me by responsibility long before the altar, and that responsibility could not be erased by social preference. The room fell into a silence different from the church's. Silence. This silence had shape. It carried calculations. Every person present understood that the bride's family had gambled on the county's appetite for a villain, and the Duke's household had answered with ink and seals. The committee members' expression tightened. The trustees' representatives' gloves shifted again, a small sign of recalibration. The bride's mother's composure held, but the line around her mouth hardened. The bride's face remained controlled, yet her stillness began to look less like virtue and more like containment. The attack changed form immediately. If they could not remove me as a corrupting influence, they would try to reduce the Duke by framing his actions as instability. They would suggest that even if I was legally protected, his refusal at the altar remained a public shock that endangered the county's faith in his governance. They would imply that a Duke who could disrupt a marriage contract could disrupt other contracts. They would hint that oversight by trustees was simply prudent. The Duke did not respond with anger. He responded with the one move that made even disciplined men flinch. He made his refusal look strategic rather than emotional. He directed attention to a portion of the documents that referenced settlement terms and conditions, clauses tied to inheritance, to trusteeship, to the protection of certain interests. The implication was not spoken as accusation, but it hung in the room, that entering the marriage would have entangled the estate in obligations that conflicted with existing trusts. The refusal, therefore, was not a collapse. It was prevention. In that moment, the bride's family's position became dangerous. They were no longer merely wronged. They risked appearing opportunistic. The trustee's representative requested time to review the documents fully, which was the closest the room would ever come to admitting uncertainty. The committee member, eager to regain control of the evening, suggested that nothing further be discussed publicly. The group began to disperse with forced smoothness, carrying the tension back into the hall disguised as courtesy. When we returned, the music had resumed, and laughter floated as if the building had not just hosted a private trial. Yet the hall's atmosphere had changed. The people who had been bold with pity now became cautious. The people who had been eager to punish now watched for which direction the trustees would lean. The bride's circle tightened around her with the protective closeness of women who understand that even virtue can lose if it loses power. The Duke's mother held her position with the calm of someone who has not won, but has prevented immediate defeat. Then, as the evening drew toward its final movements, a servant approached the Duke's solicitor and placed something in his hand, small, folded, and sealed with wax that was not from our house. The solicitor's face did not change, but his eyes lifted to the Duke at once. The Duke's hand, which had been steady all night, paused for a fraction of a second as he received the item. He did not open it in the hall. He did not even look at the seal for long. He slipped it into his pocket with a controlled motion that suggested he already understood it was meant to arrive here, now, among witnesses. A minute later, the Duke's mother's gaze found mine across the room, and for the first time in weeks, her expression carried something beyond calculation. Not warmth, not cruelty, a kind of recognition that the battle had shifted into a space where even she could not fully control the consequences. And as we left the hall under the weight of 100 watching eyes, I saw the bride turn her face slightly away, composed as ever, while her mother leaned in close, not to comfort but to confer, her gloved hand tightening on her daughter's wrist, as if anchoring her to the only thing that still mattered. In the carriage, as the town's lights receded and the estate road swallowed us into darkness, the Duke finally drew out the sealed item and held it just long enough for the wax to catch the lantern glow. It bore the crest of the bride's family, but the handwriting on the front was not the bride's mother's hand. It was mine. The crest in the lantern glow should have comforted no one. It belonged to the bride's family, and their seal had already proven it could arrive wrapped in civility and still cut like glass. Yet the handwriting on the front was worse than any threat, because it did not belong there. It belonged to me. My letters, my curves, my habits of forming certain strokes to conserve ink. The Duke turned the packet once, as if hoping angle alone might change the truth. The carriage continued along the estate road with its steady rocking, the sort of movement that usually lulls the mind into gentler thoughts. This time it only deepened the dread, because rhythm gives space for realization. I had not written anything to the bride's family. I had not even been permitted paper without oversight. The thought landed with brutal clarity. Someone had practiced my hand, or someone had held an older sample long enough to imitate it. In a world where reputation is evidence, forging a woman's handwriting is not merely deception. It is ownership. It is the creation of a confession before the accused has spoken. The Duke did not open it in the carriage. That restraint was not patience. It was strategy. If the packet contained an allegation, reading it too soon risked reacting without witnesses. If it contained a copy of something meant to be circulated, opening it inside the house could trigger immediate leaks through servants paid to report. He waited until we reached the estate, until the carriage doors closed behind us and the hallway swallowed sound into rugs and heavy drapery. The house received us like a fortress that had spent the evening pretending it was a ballroom. Lamps were low, servants fewer, corridors cleared as if the walls had been instructed to keep the secret. The Duke walked directly to the study without allowing the household to gather itself around him. His mother was there already, sitting at the desk as if she had never left it, hands folded, posture flawless. The solicitor stood near the fire with his case, his expression prepared for whatever paper might demand. Even the air smelled different, less like home, more like archives. The Duke placed the packet beside the signet ring and did not touch either for a breath. In that pause, the room acknowledged an unspoken fact. This was no longer a question of whether the Duke could marry whom he wished. It was a question of whether the household could be made to kneel by a manufactured story. The seal broke cleanly, the paper inside unfolded with insulting neatness. It was written as a statement, not a plea, a confession of impropriety, a declaration that I had pursued influence, a suggestion that I had manipulated affection and then sought to threaten the bride's family into silence. It referenced private moments I had never lived, described meetings that had never occurred, and attached motives I had never held. The language was carefully chosen, soft enough to sound like shame, firm enough to read like certainty. It was designed to be believable because it was designed to sound like what society already wanted to believe. What made it lethal was not the content, it was the intention behind it. This was meant to circulate. It was meant to be copied. It was meant to appear in the hands of women who would gasp and then pass it along. It was meant to reach trustees and clergymen as proof that the Duke had been compromised not by love, but by disgrace. If the county received my confession, the legal documents from the locked box would no longer protect me. They would become evidence that the estate had sheltered someone unworthy. Morality would be weaponized to pressure trustees into action, and trustees, being men who feared scandal infecting property, would respond faster to shame than to nuance. The Duke's mother did not smile. She did not show triumph at finding a way to remove me. She did something rarer and more alarming. She looked offended on behalf of the house. That shift mattered. It meant the bride's family had overplayed their hand. They had not merely tried to restore the bride's honor. They had attempted to dictate terms within another household's walls. They had tried to seize control of the narrative so thoroughly that even the Duke's mother, who would gladly have sacrificed a scandalous girl for stability, could not tolerate the implication that her house could be commanded by outsiders. The solicitor read the paper again, focusing not on sentiment but on mechanics. He compared the handwriting to the signature. He noted inconsistencies that would mean nothing to a gossiping drawing room, but everything to a legal mind. The spacing between lines, the pressure of strokes, the pattern of certain letters that forgers often misunderstand. He then requested the household's records of my writing, any notes, lists, inventories I had ever been permitted to produce. It was the first time my years of being useful, copying labels, arranging household lists, writing small notes for errands, became a shield rather than a chain. Within an hour, the study table held my past like a ledger of existence. A note to the housekeeper regarding linens, a list of books for dusting, a label for a jar in the still room, harmless scraps that had once proved I belonged nowhere significant. Now they proved something more valuable. Consistency. The forged statement failed under scrutiny, not because it was clumsy, but because truth has habits and forgery has haste. The Duke did not relax. He did not allow the room to settle into relief. Relief would be premature. He understood the county would never submit simply because a document was false. The county submits only when the powerful decide which lie is allowed to survive. That night, the Duke made his first move that looked like mercy, but functioned as discipline. He ordered that no servant leave the estate without permission until morning. Not as imprisonment, but as protection. Protection from bribery, from gossip, from the small, poisonous privilege of being the first to tell a story. He also ordered that a sealed notice be sent at dawn to the trustee's representative and to the magistrate requesting a private review of the forged confession and its implications. He did not request pity. He requested procedure. Procedure is the only language that can force powerful families to slow down. The next day, the bride's family attempted to regain control through speed. A messenger arrived early, bringing a note of grave concern that the confession had been provided voluntarily and that the bride's family wished to avoid public scandal by encouraging the Duke to act privately and decisively. The note was not quite a threat. It was the shape of a threat wearing gloves. The Duke's mother received it with a calm that now looked less like coldness and more like mastery. She instructed the messenger to wait, which is the simplest way to humiliate an ambitious house, to treat their urgency as inconvenience. She then arranged the day's schedule with ruthless clarity. The trustee's representative would arrive by noon. The magistrate's cousin would be invited to witness a formal statement. The rector would be present, not as a moral judge, but as a respectable observer whose memory would be difficult to challenge. Every detail was designed to prevent the bride's family from later claiming the Duke's household acted in secrecy. When the trustee's representative arrived, the study became a chamber of controlled revelation. The forged confession was presented alongside my genuine writing. Samples. The solicitor explained the inconsistencies without theatrics. The Duke sat upright, signet ring now returned to his hand, not for vanity, but for symbolism. It was a visible reminder that he remained the estate's authority. His mother's posture remained perfect, yet her eyes carried something new, an insistence that her house would not be used as another family's theater. The trustee's representative listened with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that neutrality is a shield. Yet even shields shift when a blow lands too close. The representative requested to see the original documents from the locked box again, ensuring that the chain of custody and authenticity could not be challenged. The solicitor complied. The papers were laid out, seals were inspected, dates were traced. The room behaved like a court without calling itself one. By mid-afternoon, the danger began to turn, not into safety, but into advantage. If the bride's family had circulated a forgery, they had exposed their willingness to manipulate evidence. That willingness could be used to undermine their moral authority, precisely the authority they had relied on to command sympathy after the altar. A wronged family may be pitied. A deceptive family becomes suspect. And in a county that survives on trust, suspicion is a slow death. The Duke did not aim for revenge. Revenge would have satisfied the county's appetite for drama, but would have made him appear emotional. And emotional men are easy to control. Instead, he aimed for correction. Correction is what power does when it wishes to remain legitimate. A discreet letter was drafted, brief, factual, and deadly in its calm. It stated that certain documents had been presented to the Duke's household bearing forged handwriting, and that the matter had been referred for proper review by trustees and magistrate witnesses. It did not name the bride publicly. It did not accuse the family outright. It simply established that there was a forgery and that the Duke's house would not be handled by rumor. The letter was sent not to everyone, but to a select circle of influential households whose opinions shaped the rest. It was enough. In society, one controlled statement from a duke can quiet 1,000 whispers, provided it offers the county an exit that does not shame them for having whispered. The social weather shifted accordingly. The ladies who had been eager to condemn began to become cautious. Caution arrived disguised as charity, a card delivered to the Duke's mother expressing support in difficult circumstances. The same women who had frozen me out now sought to ensure they were not recorded as having stood on the wrong side of a forgery scandal. Men who had avoided the Duke now found reasons to discuss estate matters, offering neutral respect that signaled willingness to align with the stable power. Invitations did not return overnight. Society does not reverse itself quickly, but the aggressive withdrawal softened. The county stopped feeding on the story and began to wait for authority to declare it resolved. The bride's circle tightened. In response, her mother increased her public appearances, emphasizing dignity, charity, and restraint. The bride continued to present virtue, but virtue now had a shadow, the possibility that her family's hands were not clean. The county, always hungry for superiority, began to question her perfection with the same quiet delight it had once used to question my worth. Inside the estate, the most significant shift was not in invitations. It was in how the household began to treat me. The servants did not suddenly become affectionate. Affection was not expected, and would have been improper. But the careful surveillance lessened. The housekeeper's tone became less guarded. The butler's courtesies became more consistent, less forced. Small privileges returned, not out of kindness, but out of recognition that my presence was no longer purely a liability. I was, in the cold mathematics of aristocratic survival, a protected element tied to legal obligations. That protection changed everything. It gave me a place within the house that could not be erased without consequences. The Duke's mother summoned me privately, not to punish, not to apologize, simply to measure the new arrangement with clear eyes. She presented a set of terms as if she were discussing household repairs. My status would be defined not as servant and not as guest, but as ward under the estate's protection, until legal clarity was complete. My movements would be proper. My appearances would be controlled. My education and conduct would be supervised to prevent the county from claiming impropriety. And, most tellingly, she ensured that a small allowance would be set aside in my name, recorded properly, so no one could later claim I had been kept without. Provision. She was building legitimacy around me like stone around a vulnerable foundation. It was not warmth, it was governance. The Duke's role in this stage remained disciplined. He did not attempt to declare devotion. He did not attempt to transform the story into romance to soften the county's hostility. He allowed the legal framework to do the work first. He understood that love without permission is scandal, but responsibility endorsed by institutions is power. And he was determined to turn the county's accusation into a structure that could not be undone. Yet romance in our world rarely arrives as flowers. It arrives as a risk someone chooses to carry. Late one evening, I passed the library corridor and saw the Duke inside. Alone, the locked box now returned to its shelf but no longer sealed away. He stood with a paper in hand, reading it slowly as if memorizing each line. His expression was not soft, it was deliberate. And on the desk beside him lay a new document, folded and ready, bearing the estate's crest and a space. for a signature that would change my life's shape without a single spoken vow. When he noticed me at the doorway, he did not call me in. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply placed his hand on the folded document and held it there, as if anchoring it against the wind of the county's opinion. The gesture was small, but it contained everything that mattered. He was preparing to bind himself to my safety in a way no rumor could unbind. Then, from the far end of the corridor, footsteps approached, unhurried, purposeful, followed by the soft scrape of a letter being slid beneath a door elsewhere in the house. A letter that, by the weight of the silence that followed, carried a seal no one in the estate had expected to see again.